Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on corruption and COVID-19 financing, lessons from Caribbean. This panel will explore several important questions related to COVID-19 and its management, such as what can the Caribbean learn about managing corruption, fraud, and other risks during the COVID-19 pandemic? Dealing with risk of fraud, corruption, and COVID-19 emergency procurement, pricing, fake vaccines, and bribery. Some of the key things that we will be discussing, issues related to public oversight, issues related to procurement, and some of the key considerations that we should have in mind as we move forward throughout this pandemic. The focus of this panel is global in nature, as we will be discussing some of the global issues, trends with respect to how COVID-19 has been handled, and particularly some of the key lessons that we in the Caribbean can learn, and what are some of the tools that we can include to reduce the incidence of corruption at this time. On this panel, we have two very well-known experts in the field of anti-corruption and public accountability who will share their insights on the COVID-19 pandemic and corruption. First on the lineup, we have Professor NIkos Passas, who is a professor of criminology and criminal justice of Northeastern University and a globally acknowledged and renowned expert in anti-corruption. Secondly, we have Ms. Corina Rebegea, advisor of the National Democratic Institute, a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan organization working to support and strengthen democratic institutions worldwide through citizen participation, openness, and accountability in government. I am Josh Drayton, Financial Crimes and Asset Recovery Specialist at CARICOM IMPACS, and the moderator for this panel. We have seen a lot over the past 2 years. It's almost been 2 years since the WHO declared the COVID-19 a pandemic, global pandemic for that. We have heard quite a bit from governments related to how they have been able to respond to emergency procurement issues. We've also seen from citizens demands of greater accountability and transparency as governments engage in these processes. So what we would like to hear a bit more from both Professor Passas as well as Corina is how have governments throughout the world addressed issues related to corruption at this time during the pandemic. So I'll hand over to Professor Passas, who will give some opening remarks, and thereafter to Corina. So over to you, Professor Passas.
Hello, good morning, and thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to your conference. So the problem of anti-corruption has been for some time now that we have invested a lot of resources. We have created a lot of legal and texts and normative content in order to frame the anti-corruption agenda and action. And we have invested a lot of money, institutions, and raised hopes that we are going to do better. We had also a couple of decades to show results, and the results are disappointing. We have seen that in many parts of the world, regardless of what metric you are using, the scores are dropping and the satisfaction level for governance is dropping in many parts of the world. In other parts of the world, what we see is anti-corruption rules, institutions, and procedures are used in a discriminatory way, and they take care of the opposition or the political enemies of those in power. We see impunity of top officials and more focus on minor offenses and low-level, low-hanging fruit type of corruption. Too much bureaucratic response to scandals. Legal and regulatory complexity is becoming part of the answer, but throwing low at the problem has not solved the problem. And the end result is that compliance, practice of anti-corruption, and ethical norms do not always align. The progress sometimes is reversible. Sometimes we see steps back. And this is what demoralizes the youth, and we see brain drain and capital flight that undermine economic growth and the future of our societies. So these are the challenges that we had before COVID. But like any other emergency, COVID tested the quality of governance that we had. And there are three ways in which you can think about it. First is preparedness. How well did we anticipate what was happening? Because there were warnings for decades on what was coming, on what happened in other parts of the world with different diseases. And we had playbooks and blueprints in place. Were we ready? And the answer is, unfortunately, not very. Secondly, the second criterion is how well, once a crisis arises, how well do we respond? And here the response has been extremely diverse. You have seen countries that were well governed with charismatic leaders and high legitimacy doing well. And you have seen other countries rich, well-resourced, with scientific capital, with pharmaceutical industry, drop the ball. And the third criterion is how well we keep an eye on the future as we respond to the current crisis so that we do not create laws, precedents, or vested interests that are going to grow a life of their own and that are going to have long-lasting consequences affecting our future. So there are two concepts that I wanted to give you as ways of analyzing and organizing the material, the empirical information that is springing from different corners of the earth. The first one is the idea of lawful but awful practices. We get very often focused on what is legally proscribed, what is prohibited, what is criminalized, and how corruption is defined in law. But what is more important is what practices, even legal, what consequences even legal practices may have. If the consequences of legal actions are just as bad as organized crime, then as a matter of public policy, we'll need to think again and go back to the drawing board. And this is what I call lawful but awful practices. Things that governments allow, sometimes they subsidize, but when you look at what effects they produce on the ground, they are worse than serious criminality. The other concept is that of criminogenic asymmetries. When you have different systems or actors with diverse legal, cultural, political, economic, technological, geographical, or health type of characteristics, opportunities for corruption and crime arise, motives for taking advantage of these opportunities become plentiful, and controls against such action become weakened because we're paying attention to the emergency, because we're saying now we're going to make tons of money available to save the economy, and we'll look for anti-corruption and accountability down the road. That is what weakens controls, and unfortunately that's precisely the time when anti-corruption, integrity and accountability mechanisms are absolutely essential in order to ensure that at the time of need, inequalities do not grow, public health and economic problems do not become bigger, and the bigger fish take advantage of that and get away with it, as we have seen in numerous countries around the world. So we have seen a perfect storm of a predicted, well forecasted emergency. We had our guard down. We have seen misinformation, populism, and vaccine nationalisms get in the way of this. We have seen asymmetric markets with demand and supply for protective equipment, for treatments, for vaccines, give rise to illegal markets for substandard and fake medical products, even certificates of vaccination or negative tests. And we see that, on the one hand, speaking of the country where I reside, the United States, you have an over-medicated society. You have the highest per capita consumption of pharmaceutical products and resort to doctors for mental and physical health. And at the same time, you have high levels of hesitancy for a life-saving vaccine that also supports the economy. So these are some of the contradictions that you can see even in OECD countries, where the COVID-19 emergency has been managed in ways that leaves plenty of room for improvement. And I will be happy. I've been studying since the beginning of the pandemic the issue of illegal medical supply chains and corruption issues, as well as other types of crime. And I will be happy to discuss particular countries' patterns and cases in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Passas. You covered a lot of ground there, giving us a lot to ask about in terms of how are those things that you've said relate to the Caribbean region and what is the impact for us and some of the tools and lessons. Corina, can you tell us a bit more about your insight into this COVID-19 pandemic and corruption?
Absolutely, and thank you, Josh, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be with you all today. This is a very important conversation, and it is the topic that sort of keeps us busy and has been keeping us busy for the past couple of years. And going right in, you mentioned at the beginning, Josh, that NDI is a democracy-oriented organization. And I would like to say that we put at the heart of our efforts to build accountability and integrity across the sort of the public system, we put this concept of democratic delivery. Is our democracies able to respond to citizens' needs and expectations? And we've seen that, for instance, reflected just earlier this week on Monday when President Biden published the first US national strategy to counter corruption. So fighting corruption is a central piece to what we think about when we think about what democracy is, and not just in terms of processes, but also the ability to deliver outcomes. And that has been put to test quite heavily, and we've heard this already from Professor Passas as well, during the pandemic. So our approach is focused on prevention and on building good governance structures and accountability ecosystems that can sort of bolster our defenses to existing and future crises. So having this idea of democratic resilience in mind as well. And we also work across different pillars of political power and focus on building integrity at all levels of governance. So central, local, working with civil society, working with business environment, with international bodies as well. And we see this as an important pillar of doing work that supports accountability and integrity. So with these premises in mind, I see corruption or the COVID crisis as a confluence of three main problems, and this is not going to be any news to anybody. But first of all, we had this imperative of responding to the crisis and the need for speed that sometimes has overshadowed other concerns in terms of governance or even equitable distribution of public goods and services. Second, we've seen an increased availability of financial resources. So worldwide, according to some estimates, this has probably been the biggest recovery package since the Second World War, with some $20 trillion available, again, across the world for recovery measures. And every time there is more money available, there's also more incentives and more opportunities for corruption. And third, and this is a cross-cutting theme, is the weakening of oversight. Because of the pandemic, both in sort of objective stumble blocks, if you will, and sometimes other types of reasons, the weakening of oversight has allowed corruption to thrive. So if we think about these three main issues, I would flag perhaps three main findings. This idea of need for speed. What we've seen from the research and experiences of countries throughout these 2 years of the pandemic is that speed or swift action does not necessarily equate effective action or effective governance. On the contrary, in many cases, the urgency concerns were used as an excuse to override transparency and accountability, even inclusivity in response measures, or they were used to cover up poor decisions or wasteful or corruption implementation of the pandemic response measures. And this will continue to be a challenge as countries are still rolling out relief measures and vaccination campaigns, and striking the balance between speed and good governance and integrity is going to be crucial. Second, of course, corruption. Our need for speed has an impact on how we're dealing with corruption as both an underlying condition, as we've heard from Professor Passas, factor or a multiplying factor for many of the crises that we are experiencing today. And it's not just the pandemic, it's also the climate crisis, poverty, and so on. So I already mentioned that there's more resources available, but at the same time, there's less resources available. And examples of corruption during the pandemic were numerous all over the world. And we're beginning to see estimates of how much money was lost from the available sums for recovery to corruption. So just to give you an example, Transparency International did an analysis of media reports about COVID-19 corruption cases across the world, and in only 17 countries, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, $1.1 billion were lost. And this is money that could have gone to better medical care and other response measures. And yet at the same time, perhaps also because so much money is being lost to corruption, countries are struggling to getting the necessary funding. And in some countries, for instance, the vaccination campaign alone can cost up to two-thirds of the entire national health budget. So that puts incredible strain on economies and on governments, but also leads to gaps in compliance, oversight, accountability, and so on. And I think with all these examples of corruption-related behaviors, I think everyone is well aware of the different directions in which we've seen failures in our governance systems and opportunities for corruption. Procurement is probably one of the biggest, either because it was rushed, so unvetted companies were gaining access to really high sums of money sometimes for services they had never provided before. Many media stories about this. Or contracts were awarded to people that were already accused of fraud or had political connections, which of course signals the importance of beneficial ownership transparency, a big topic on the international agenda now. Sometimes, direct stealing of money from funds allocated to stimulus packages, and sometimes, by high-level politicians, and those politicians then try to launder their reputation by donating money or goods after embezzling public funds into the health system. So we can go into more detail about that later. But third, I wanted to look at the third big finding, and I find this really crucial to everything, and that's the fact that the oversight and accountability mechanisms, so that's just more of the supportive structures of governance, were weakened really across the board during the pandemic. And in some parts of the world, this has been part of an ongoing trend. We heard about the de-democratization or the backsliding, while in some other parts, these were due to objective public health concerns. Parliaments had to shut down, activity was delayed, courts, prosecution offices had to shut down, and so on. So some of these challenges, I think, strike to the core of the effectiveness and integrity of our crisis response. Whether the legislatures were involved in the policymaking and planning, in the dispersal of pandemic relief funds, whether there was enough transparency and access to information about where the money was coming from, where it was going, and how it was being administered. Or emergency funds used extra budgetary procedures that had fewer oversight mechanisms built in, so that funds could be sent and spent expeditiously. So parliaments and oversight bodies did not have an opportunity to look into these extra budgetary procedures. Audits, for instance, an important tool in ensuring oversight and accountability, are to this date still struggling to catch up to the changes in procedure. They're moving too slowly for real accountability. And again, that has hurt the integrity of a pandemic response. And then I would also add the limited opportunities for citizen participation. And of course, CSOs play a really important role in ensuring oversight and ensuring demanding accountability, keeping decision makers sort of on their toes, holding them responsible. And this was definitely not happening thoroughly as it should have during the pandemic. And not least, I want to bring, because we are in sort of talking to a regional bank, the increased levels of debt. We've seen debt levels going through the roof in the past couple of years, and this is part of a decade-long trend, if not longer. But that came with low standards of transparency and accountability, which led international bodies and civil society groups to really demand more transparency. And I think that's an interesting dimension of corruption. So all of these really lead to a decrease in citizens' confidence and trust in governance and in democratic governance and in democracy itself. And I think that should be really concerning for all of us, because that undermines the very structure of the system in which we operate. And if you look at the recent Americas barometer, right, to which the Caribbean region belongs, or the Afrobarometer, the results are consistent. People see corruption, they see corruption growing, and they're growing increasingly dissatisfied with their democracy. In Latin America and the Caribbean, more than 3 in 5 people believe that most or all politicians are corrupt. Now, that doesn't bode well for what's to come and for how we prepare for future crises. And finally, just 1 minute on how to think about solutions. From our perspective, good governance is, again, at the core of this, and it should be the supporting structure of any anti-corruption effort. So 3 main directions. 1, looking at the accountability ecosystems at the national level, how we can engage with a variety of stakeholders, governmental and non-governmental, to make sure that we build a resilient system that can face future crises. And I think that was one of the big lessons of the pandemic. Second, cooperation at the regional level is also very important, and it can be, formal through multilateral institutions, through regional institutions, but it can be through coalitions of NGOs. And again, I'd like to stress the importance of civil society. We've seen numerous examples where civil society came together and, for instance, implemented systems of corruption red flagging in public procurement during the pandemic. And third, corruption is becoming increasingly transnational. So regional and international cooperation is very important if we are going to tackle illicit money flows and the need to harmonize different norms and practices, enforcing them, and so on. So with these three potential ideas, I hope we can go in the conversation, and thanks for bearing with me.
And thank you very much, Corina. Again, a very comprehensive overview in terms of what we have learned from the pandemic, some of the data coming out throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and of course, some of our colleagues in the African continent. Professor Passas, I want to jump back over to some of the things that you said, especially related to those three areas: preparedness, response, and of course, how do we respond to the current crisis? And I think one of the key things, do you feel that globally there was this level of preparedness to deal with, in the first instance, COVID-19, but also secondly, to address corruption within COVID-19? And I say this on the heels because if we don't have the necessary things in place prior to the pandemic, of course, the pandemic would further exacerbate weak systems, essentially. So can you tell us a bit more about the level of preparedness globally to engage in something like the pandemic, and of course, what was the response therefore in terms of addressing issues related to corruption, fraud, and procurement?
Right. Well, in my view, we have a glorious example of market failure because we have delegated too many things to the market in order to determine the research priorities, drug discovery, and prioritization of the pharmaceutical sector. There was a lobbying effort that killed an initiative in the European Union, for example, where on the table was a proposal to actually focus research on vaccines and preventive methods against the kind of viruses that we are dealing with right now, COVID-19. This was something that was predicted. This was something that was discussed. This was something that even fiction writers who had interviewed experts in public health had written about in remarkable similarity to what actually happened. So we were not ready, despite the fact that on paper, with the metrics that we use, certain countries were extremely well prepared for that. And I put the United States in that category as well. There is no excuse for the United States to face the crisis that it is going through right now with all the resources, the technical knowledge, and the capacity that it has. In terms of lawful but awful practices, because I would like to illustrate the points that I made earlier also. We have, and thanks to a Caribbean country, in fact, we have an insight into the practice of one pharmaceutical company that before its vaccine had completed the trials, had teams approaching high-level governments in order to gain contracts with extraordinary terms that would waive all kinds of liability, even for manufacturing mistakes and fault on the part of the producer, the manufacturer, and also would mortgage the national resources of the country in order to ensure that the payment would be made. And that was in several Latin American countries, this team was turned away. In others, they had to go along because they needed the vaccine. You can see the asymmetric power between the one with the knowledge, the capacity to produce something that deals with COVID, and those who would like to have it, but may not be in the best position to afford it. And it was a researcher and an investigative reporter in London who got an award for revealing these practices. And on her website, she has the document that countries were asked to sign, and you can see the extent to which it was a kind of neo-colonial kind of arrangement where the strings attached, the loss of sovereignty, were reminiscent of past practices. And then we had the vaccines. And then we had the vaccines to a large extent thanks to public financing. And then we had public statements about vaccine equity and the need to take care of every corner of the earth because we're in it together. Because if we do not look after everyone, then we're going to have new variants. The virus multiplies, takes new forms, and we had Delta, we had Omicron, we had a number of varieties. It's multiplying and it is evolving every day because it is spreading uncontrolled in parts of the world where we have single-digit vaccination rates to this date. So the arrangements on what is the role and responsibility of government on the one hand, the private sector on the other, and civil society in the third part, has to be rediscussed, redrawn. Because when we allow the markets to take care of this in a neoliberal kind of way, we are in the boat that we are sailing in right now. And that's not the best boat to be in. So at the same time, we have seen interventions in the markets. But you see that, for example, in the United States, thanks to these interventions, a handful of people have made more money during the pandemic than it would be sufficient to vaccinate the entire planet. So a fraction of what a handful of billionaires made in the United States is enough to vaccinate everyone. And you have countries where you have multiple reserves of vaccine, even though they have high hesitancy rates, so they are hoarding essentially the vaccine. And you have other countries where the acceptance rate is extremely high, but you do not have availability. So you have the demand and supply asymmetry that creates the market for the fakes, the corruption, the overpricing, the price gouging, and all the rest of it. So this is part of what is common and what is private that needs to be rethought, especially at a time of a crisis like this, because this crisis simply magnifies and exacerbates problems that we had before and problems that we're going to have again in the future. It's not the first nor the last epidemic. It's not the first nor the last time that we had illegal markets for fake drugs and treatments and medical equipment or certificates about these things. Those are things that we need to learn from our history, and we need to apply those lessons to our future. Because also another important point, and again, the Caribbean is going to experience this in the near future, is this is a prova generale. This is a rehearsal of the big climate challenge that we're going to have down the road. It's again the same kind of problem where you have nationalisms and populisms that forget the metaphor of the swimming pool. You cannot designate a corner of your swimming pool as a toilet and expect to swim cleanly in the rest of the pool. If we do not look after everyone in health, in environment, we all experience the same results. It's a boomerang, it's self-defeating, it's bad governance, it's institutional corruption, because faith in governments and institutions goes down. the capacity of these institutions to deliver what they're supposed to do in terms of public policy is weakened, and that is the lawful but awful situation, regardless of what the law says. We need to go back to the drawing board and fix this for the good of our children and their children. Otherwise, we will have to answer, what were we doing when we had a voice, when we had the data, when we had the capacity to do something about it?
And Professor Passas, I think you were able to capture some of the global social inequalities and the global abuse and exploitation coming out of COVID-19. And as you mentioned, it's lawful but awful practices because they're facilitated legally, but the practice in itself is unethical. And I think it's a good segue, Corina, into your work that you're doing, which is the proportionate nature of the evolving role of government and the evolving role of public oversight and public accountability. So can you tell us a bit more about the level of public accountability? And I'm using public accountability broadly in this instance to include citizen oversight in one instance, and then of course legislative or parliamentary oversight, which you referenced earlier on. So can you tell us a bit more of this evolving nature and what governments may have to do now, learning from this, as you said, Professor Passas, address rehearsal for climate change. So Corina.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And I have to start by saying that the oversight mechanisms being, those placed with the legislatures or elsewhere, were sort of caught on the back foot by the pandemic, and it shouldn't. Professor Passas has already gone into some detail about how unprepared we were with this pandemic. But I think, to focus on the positives, there were ways that we can learn from and some lessons for better preparing for the future and building more resilient institutions that we've seen, at least in some parts of the world. So, for instance, parliaments, because you mentioned parliaments, had to adapt really quickly to going online. And sometimes this was not possible, either because the infrastructure was not there or the legal framework was not there. Sometimes the Constitution asks parliamentarians to only vote if they're in person and so on. So there were all sorts of constraints. Many times these constraints came from the executive and an executive overreach of power in trying to shut down the opportunities for members of parliament, the representative body, to meet and discuss the pandemic measures and the recovery packages. But I think in some parts of the world, we've seen efforts, and I think we can learn from that, at creating, for instance, specialized committees that dealt with COVID. We've seen adaptations in terms of going digital, and I see there is a question in the chat as well about how this has helped. It has helped tremendously once parliaments and other bodies were able to adjust and move their sessions online. And some places, actually, these sessions were broadcast on Facebook so that citizens could also see and participate. And we've seen special oversight committees emerge. We've seen, but these are again just a few examples in a sea of examples where the institutions have not worked really well. And one of the victims of the pandemic has also been citizen engagement and transparency. So if we look, for instance, at the global research that Freedom House did, one of the biggest victims of the pandemic has been transparency. Institutions have not answered any requests for public informations or used the pandemic to delay responses when citizen groups asked for this access. There were less opportunities for consultation, and then less opportunities even for protest, although I think civil society has done a good job coming up with that. And then just to to highlight perhaps a good practice that we've also seen developing during the pandemic in some countries has been, again, to answer that question, going digital when it comes to public procurement. And some countries have taken important steps to adopt the open data standards, for instance, in public procurement, make sure that this is all available to everybody so that civil society could track what was happening, what type of contracts, the amounts, who those companies that were winning the awards were, and so on. There's still a lot of gaps, I think, thinking from central government reform and the central procurement agencies, and then how this is being implemented at local level, at subnational level, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think we can learn from all of these practices and make sure that we have these mechanisms in place now, even as we're dealing with the crisis, so that we're not caught again in the same situation when the next crisis, and that will come probably sooner than we think.
And thank you very much, Corina, for that interesting balance between recognizing how digitization essentially fast-track public accountability and openness on one hand and citizen engagement, but also in some instances there were impediments in terms of access to information, which then affect, of course, the quality of public oversight, specifically citizen or civil society oversight. And what I want to move into now is that there's a question here: how have Caribbean countries achieved a balance of mitigating corruption in COVID financing while at the same time tackling the pandemic? So I don't know, Professor Passas, if you would want to respond to this question.
Well, if there is one takeaway from what I have to say is the following. Whenever we have an emergency, we have emergency context interpreted as we do not apply due process and the usual anti-corruption controls. To some extent, this is understandable, but it is the wrong way to approach the problem. It is precisely during emergencies that anti-corruption matters. That is when people suffer. That is when people's vulnerabilities are multiplied. That is when accountability has to be actually more severe rather than more lenient. We're taking advantage of people in need, fragile communities. So in the past, we have seen far too many examples where when there isn't an emergency, we invent one in order to bypass usual controls. So not have a bidding competition or to make up the specifications so that we give the project, the grant to someone we want to favor, and all the rest of it. So when we don't have emergency, we fake it. The bottom line is that we do all this because we accept the premise that during emergencies, other things come first, and anti-corruption is the lower priority. It has to be higher priority. That does not mean more bureaucracy and more signatures and more paperwork and higher cost or compliance. What it means, through new technologies, through citizen participation, through websites, through openness, you actually open it up to take advantage of the emergency situation to show how the government runs openly and clearly and is accountable to its people and set an example. So that is the lesson to learn. That is the stepping stone to build on, to create islands of integrity and build for sustainable reforms going forward. So that is the key point from my perspective.
And thank you, Professor Passas, for being able to one, show this is the takeaway from here, because Corina, that's what I'm coming to you. What's the takeaway from all of this in terms of your understanding of the lay of the land?
Well, Unfortunately, I can't speak to the Caribbean region. It's not my region of expertise. But just adding, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Professor Passas just said. But maybe just to add perhaps the regional and sort of transnational or international dimension here. And I think there is a role for supranational organizations, multilateral or different forms of regional integration to address the issue as well. Again, recognizing that one, crises are transnational, and two, corruption is transnational. So, and I think we've seen some examples even recently on how countries can collectively act to sanction corrupt behavior or take action. And then hopefully we will see this and also in terms of preparing for future crises. And I would maybe just flag one example, and that's the IMF, I think it's called the governance report, and they started looking into, they worked with countries, they started looking into particularly, sensitive points in the public governance system, and that was beneficial ownership, transparency, and public procurement. And I think, having also this approach where countries come together and kind of provide checks on each other, and you have an international body perhaps that also is able to create some stimuli or incentives for countries to comply, also offer some capacity there. I think that's something that should be considered in the future. Well, actually should be considered now.
And could I add just one more thing, since we do have a couple of minutes left? I just wanted to say that people too often talk about dreaming about a return to normality. It is this normality that got us where we are now. It's not what we want to wish for. Okay, this is not a roundabout that we take a turn and go back to where we came from. This is a gateway that we need to cross. We leave some old baggage, bad baggage behind, and we build a better future for the next generation. Because what we eat, what we hunt, what we research, what we prioritize, what we delegate to the private sector and the markets, how we do our governance is where got us to where we are now. So we don't want to repeat history. We want to change it. And that is the hopeful message. That is how you use a crisis as an opportunity for something better, as opposed to the arguments coming from disaster capitalism that disasters are there for the powerful to take advantage of the powerless.
And thank you very much, Professor Passas, for bringing it all together. Thank you very much, Corina. I see clearly it's about building back better, building back more resilient and sustainable Caribbean countries. And what's more important now is let's not drop the ball on deepening our engagement, on bettering our governance, and increasing our oversight. And these are the key lessons coming out of this discussion. So once again, I would like to thank Professor Passas as well as Corina for your insight, your global insight, and of course, bringing that to bear in understanding our Caribbean reality in terms of COVID financing and our response to corruption. Again, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of this conference.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. All the best.
All the best.